Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 12, Revelations. Present-day Colombia. The jungle carried with it a mild moisture in the air, as the plant life all around seemed to come to life as it glistened in a soft light. The skies above clearly announced the afternoon, as the sun, while mostly blocked by the darkened fog below, remained firm directly overhead. Several breezes meandered about, causing the leaves to have a small conversation of light, distant whistles in the background. A chasm, perhaps 30 feet deep and 300 feet wide, separated two sides of its rapid river below, with its tall, grassy banks all around. Connecting either side sat a relatively sturdy bridge that represented a lightly traveled service road from one side of the river to the other. And being that the world had incurred a major shift in recent decades, the path was more overgrown as vehicles became sparser, allowing Mother Nature to take its natural course. It was here, at one side of the bridge, sat a few trucks parked within the dense jungle, making its way through said service road, while two men stood outside contemplating the crossing. It was Chavez and Marquez, and they were peering across the river through binoculars. As they stood there in silence, studying the darkened jungle across from them, Thomas joined them at their side. Without taking his eyes from his binoculars, Chavez posed a simple small question to his American friend. "We good?" And Thomas, after letting the question resonate around the small group of men, replied with his response, maintaining the simplicity of the question it answered. "Yes, my old friend. We are most certainly good." They continued to watch across the river as Thomas made his way back to the vehicle. Meanwhile, miles away, a Beltran cartel soldier sat behind the wheel of a large cargo truck. It was a very old vehicle with a seemingly makeshift large metal trailer. As it complained the entire way, creaking and scraping the ground and fauna with its steel frame, the soldier did his best to negotiate the overgrown dirt path. Suddenly, as he rounded a corner, he adjusted his eyes to focus on a development he began to quickly approach. There, about 100 yards away, sat two jeeps blocking his path. He noticed several men outside holding rifles, and as he noticed them slowly look up and gesture for him to halt, he seemed to be somewhat unfazed by it all. As he slowly approached, he was greeted by one of the men at his window. It was the Chancellor. He looked up at the driver as he began to speak. "Miguel, what is the count?" Miguel looked down at his boss. "Well over our target, sir. The American clients should be happy." The Chancellor looked at Miguel with a satisfied expression as he praised his soldier and moved on to his next objective, signaling the driver to exit his vehicle. Nicholas, standing next to his brother, spoke to the Chancellor as if to persuade. "Are you sure it is wise to go alone, brother?" The Chancellor looked at his brother and sighed. He then turned to the driver and shouted, "Out of the seat, Senor. I will be taking the delivery by myself from this point on." As Miguel dutifully complied in a timely manner, he opened his door and stepped down from the rig. Once on the ground, the Chancellor gave him a pat on his shoulder, adding to his earlier praises, while he stepped up into the large truck and took his place at the front seat. He then closed the door and adjusted the wheel and chair, and then looked out the window and down to his concerned general. "Nicholas, please. We have been working for the Russians for many years now. The Americans want to be sure they can depend on us. Trust me, my brother, once they see that we deliver, they cannot afford to turn us down. The Chinese and the Russians are giving them a run for their money. The Americans would be wise to add us to their arsenal. Our inside contact has assured us all of this," he reminded Nicholas. With that, he saluted his brother and began to drive the truck forward as the two jeeps parted to let him make his way. He watched in his rearview mirror as his cartel soldiers became smaller as he drove further away. Then he looked ahead and focused on the road, as he knew he had not much further left to go. After about 20 minutes, his objective began to come into focus as the nearby jungles became cleared in front of him. Straight ahead, in the middle of the clearing, sat a large, sizable service shack. Outside of this shack were 3 massive radio antennas that no longer served their purpose. Also, as they had been without power for years now, Mother Nature began to claim the tall structures as her own. Just outside the shack and antennas was a chain-link fence, barely hanging on to its structural integrity as weather over the years had taken a toll on the metal barrier. And just outside of that stood an American soldier holding a rifle as he gestured for the vehicle to stop. As the Chancellor took in his new surroundings, a small wave of panic swept through his entire being. As he looked around him, he noticed several other large military vehicles, each with several armed soldiers standing by watching him approach. He knew that striking a deal with his long American foe was his very last chance to keep alive, his stake in this new world, as he fought his paranoia back. The soldier that had gestured him to stop approached his side of the vehicle and spoke to him through his window. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. Your contact is waiting inside." With that, a small sense of relief washed over the Chancellor as the task given to him made him forget his worries, putting business back in the forefront of his mind. He stepped down from the vehicle and faced the young soldier less than half his age. The soldier looked at him and reached behind his back and pulled out a black cloth hood and handed it to the Chancellor. "Put this on if you want to meet your contact. He insists on keeping a low profile. These activities are not exactly backed by the last state. It's a policy not up for discussion." The Chancellor looked down in his hands and saw the black hood he now held. Against his better judgment, but knowing it was too late to turn back now, the Chancellor put his hood on, making himself feel demoted from his usual level of power several times over. Now, with the hood over his face, he felt his arm grabbed by the soldier as he began to be guided into what he assumed was the service shack ahead. But then, suddenly he was stopped. "Halt! Arms up!" A man's voice shouted as his arms were forced up by men around him. And as the Chancellor held back a possible overreaction, he quickly identified a simple pat-down was in effect as several areas upon his person became disarmed. Once completely unarmed, they guided him forward, still assuming the small shack was the target, eventually leading him to feel correct about his assumption. His surroundings became dark, signaling the entering of the service shack entrance. He was brought to a chair where he clumsily grabbed about, ultimately coming to a seat. As he sat there in silence, he calmed himself down by reasoning his doubts away. He just knew that once this deal was done, from here on out, he would be his own man again. That's when he heard several men approaching from behind. As a few came around to either side of him, he heard one of them let out a small, somewhat deep laugh. Then, he could hear them make their ways around what felt like a table in front of him to what sounded like seats of their own. It was at that point he felt a gun press up against his neck as his hood was slowly removed. And then, as he focused in, his veins ran an icy cold he had never felt before, as he could feel his entire body losing balance while the rug to his entire empire quickly slipped from under his feet. Now, sitting at a table unarmed, a man with a gun to his head, there were two men sitting across from him. It wasn't what he was expecting. It was Thomas Shields and Chavez Cruz. Chavez simply winked at him and blew him a kiss, his body still lacking warmth, as his blood still had not refortified from its recent retreat. The Chancellor looked at Chavez across from him with stern anger in his eyes. Chavez just gave a menacing smile as he leaned forward and began to speak. "I watched you pull up with vigor. This leads me to believe that it is you, my friend, who have forgotten. My business partner has much more contacts than you." And then as he lowered his voice, he continued to provoke the Chancellor with his words. "You have reduced my men to a fraction of its size. The damage it has caused will take years to repair. Therefore, my brother, when my partner is through with you, I will be taking you with me. I will keep you alive for days in a damp basement, so that you can suffer while I slowly rip you limb from limb." The Chancellor did not flinch or change his stern expression, as he was not prepared to give up so easily. He held his serious gaze at his Sinaloa counterpart as Thomas began to direct the conversation. "You seem to be unaware, Lazar. Unaware that these days there are two American factions to contend with. This pesky faction known as the Last State and the New America. The America that I control," he said, as the Chancellor noticed Chavez grow a menacing smile. Then, Thomas leaned forward in his seat and addressed the Chancellor more quietly. "You know, Lazar, you should be more careful who you get your information from. Once your so-thought mole in the New America had received your request, it was just a matter of time until we had you in our grasps. Of course, the Last State has their own moles, and not wanting to risk having this meeting in the middle of the jungle, we tried intercepting you in Tundra. Well, you know how that went. Frankly, Lazar, I was impressed. What you unleashed on us is exactly why Lenkov enlisted you. But I know you better than he does. I knew it was only a matter of time before you would attempt to strike out on your own. But Lenkov insists on keeping you on the proverbial payroll. So we will. He will just be unaware that it is not you running the South any longer. It will be the Sinaloa. Once we have things under control, you will return to the north with Chavez, and Marquez will take over your operations here. They will be one and the same with my New America. Together, they will bring the Last State to their knees. And once this happens, I will have the entire American military under my control. Sure, the New America will still work for the Oligarchy. They will still placate Arlo Brooks and his needs. But everything else will belong to me. Everything else will belong to the New America." Thomas then sighed and sat back in his seat while he continued. "If you just didn't have to be the same old you, always trying to be on the top, you could have served me well. Instead, now, you will be slowly dismembered and tortured, simply as entertainment for the man who sits with me now. A gift from me to him. A gift that will keep on giving as he rips you apart, avenging his father. Before this, however, We need to tie up some loose ends. First, we are going to have your men form with my business partners, men, the Sinaloa cartel. Your organizations will meet in a designated location my partner and I have agreed upon, Thomas ordered. In continuing, Thomas looked more serious as he leaned forward in his seat and looked into the Chancellor's eyes. Then, while you stand next to me and Senor Cruz here, your brother Nicholas will inform your men that the Sinaloa and the Beltran Leyva are now working together as one. He will explain to your men with a prepared speech I have kindly drafted that there is new management and they will report to my business partners, Mr. Cruz and his generals. Just then, the Chancellor threw his head back and laughed. And why do you think I would crumble so easily? You should just kill me now, because when you leave here, my men will not have mercy on you. That was when Thomas posed a question to Chavez, and not aware of what had become of the Sinaloa brothers. An ominous inquiry sounded within the Chancellor's ears. When do you think your uncles will be here? Shields asked Cruz. Chavez looked up at the Chancellor as he let his smile fade, looking deep into his lifelong enemy's eyes, reading all his fears he reserved for the notorious criminal brothers. 2, maybe 3 hours. They are tracking us by GPS and shouldn't be much longer. They will be excited to have a new toy. The Chancellor finally grimaced. As the afternoon skies turned into a late evening blanket of clouds, the Colombian jungle chattered away as all the surrounding wildlife tucked in for the night, making way for the night dwellers soon to awake. As the trees stood tall and covered the woodland's view of the heavens above, several torches lit a small clearing where a cartel meeting quickly became underway. Nicholas, now finding himself in a strange yet frustratingly predicted scenario, held a piece of paper and read the words before him as his brother stood by, joined by Thomas and Chavez. Nicholas spoke to his men as they stood near their rivals, the Sinaloa, while barely hiding his nervousness, trying to appear confident to his soldiers. We are shifting directions. A lucrative contract has fallen in our laps. We will all work together now. You will all now be taking orders from Senor Chavez and Senor Marquez. The Chancellor and I will be. He looked back to his brother as he noticed Thomas look at him and tap his watch, reminding him that the Sinaloa brothers shouldn't be much longer. Nicholas continued, the Chancellor and I will be departing. Ready your teams for departure. You have your orders. As one continues to follow the story, they suddenly find themselves within a vast desert, a profound scene of prophetic detail. And looking around this vast and vacant desert, it is hard to make out one's surroundings, as the sand in the air mixed with a heavy layer of pollution and radiation. This, of course, in turn, created a thick, red sandy fog all around as far as one could see. As the wind blew in and touched the ground, picking the sand up as it rose back into the air, its game plan became quite clear. As buckets of sand became swept up in these currents, they were immediately displaced a few feet above. It was then simply left to shower the desert floor below, casting golden ripples above the sandy terrain, soon returning to the desert below. From one side to another, no matter how well focused, a perspective from within this desert of chaos would only allow a few feet or so to be seen at one time. As the sandy air scraped its own desert floors, it continuously rolled up and down the sand dunes all around it. One dune after another, the pattern continued, eventually whirling over what appeared to be a raised access road. This road, as strange as it already was, here in this vacant land, was seemingly made of hard black plastic. Upon this access road stood a sign, proud and tall, defying the persistence of its not-so-better half, the horrific sandy storm that surrounded it, appearing to be somewhat endless. The sign stood as a nation's symbol, a power that held its borders with fear. And this symbol, this red emblem, announced its regime upon this sign, golden stars taking their place among it as the Chinese flag slowly came into focus. It is at this time that the sand becomes livelier than ever, as headlights can be seen approaching quickly. And just like a curtain, the sand in the air begins to part as a small military truck traverses said access road, making its way to whatever its objective. As it moved quickly, it passed the sign, and then, just as it had come into the dusty scene, so too had it left and disappeared altogether. A bird's eye view of this dusty traveler would offer a much clearer view, as the vehicle could be seen traveling away from a large military complex, now almost a mile behind its current headings. This compound, although very military in fashion, would not compare to its overseas counterparts, as it was lacking seemingly basic military hardware. Instead, this one was different, for unlike most others, this one did not boast of any military-like vehicles or war-like weaponry. Another difference could be spotted upon gazing beyond the compound, where an unsettling display could be seen. There, just beyond the barbed wire fence and cement structures of the military compound, was a large void where the earth simply seemed to dissolve. And as more sandy dunes became clearer by the second, the vastness of this land quickly announced its magnificent home, the Gobi Desert. Unfortunately, this is where the human ability to communicate utterly dissolves, as there are simply no words, no matter the dialect, to describe such a breathtaking scene. Nevertheless, a story must continue. Thus, one finds themselves within the arid skies above, peering down on the sandy desert floor below. Then they see this void, this big, dark hole. As higher and higher they ascend. But the higher one goes, the more they would realize this dark void is not just a theme of the immediate surroundings. Instead, this pattern reaches much, much further, as it would seem to cover a good portion of the earth below, stretching in all directions for thousands of miles. One explaining this scene would choose their words very carefully. As one would typically throw words around carelessly, it is for this reason that the word void must be emphasized, as this is truly in all its splendor, definable by Mother Nature and science alike, the truest of all voids, as gazing upon it brings a wave of nothingness from everything found within all nothingness. If one were to look within this void, they would simply see the lack of anything, as Earth is simply no longer there. And more troublesome than this, as this scene expands, the void seems to be growing, slowly swallowing the Earth around it. And as the void of space simply is without matter, so too is this wave of nothing on this planet man calls home. And it is currently that a bird's eye view begins to expire as the earth below begins to approach, signaling this tour's end. As the void on Earth now becomes closer, its perimeter, where it meets the Earth, now becomes a new focal point. Now, something strange, yet familiar can be seen, as an endless formation of dark figures come into view. Millions of them, locked arm in arm, surrounded the hole as they dutifully guarded it while facing away and firmly standing their ground. Now rapidly descending, approaching this edge of order and chaos, getting so close as they've passed through the clouds, they see one figure in the endless formation look up and gaze upon them. Looking back at this creature, having no face within its black hood, it comes closer and closer. It begins to shriek with an eerie scream while it rapidly approaches, the creature becoming louder and louder. As they near the now ear-piercing creature, it becomes darker and darker as its void of a face becomes still closer and closer and closer. Suddenly, waking in a sweat, Trevor immediately sat up and took in his surroundings, trying to gain his bearings. As he attempted to shake off an unsettling dream he couldn't completely recollect, he noticed Kit still soundlessly sleeping on the floor next to him. They had been traveling for over a week now and were making their way north as they felt they were closing in on their contact. It was just the night before when they had spotted a good place to shelter, perhaps an old library, however, now vacant of books. As Trevor began to focus, he could see, unlike the night before, the details of his surroundings more clearly. Shelves everywhere seemed to be in disarray, not one unit boasting of all its parts, as most lay on their sides, empty, dusty, and mostly broken in pieces. He noticed how the library was very small, possibly the size of one's living room, as he looked around from wall to wall, inspecting the interior as any responsible teammate would. He could see the door still barricaded from him and Kit placing several heavy shelving units in front of it. Just next to that, he studied the view of an empty alleyway as a broken window, with bars still intact, sat directly to the right. The air outside seemed to be almost a solid blue in color as the sun was beginning to rise. Seeing now, they were still alone, and their surroundings still appearing secure, Trevor felt confident in letting himself make a little noise as he quietly gathered himself to a standing position. That was when he noticed Kit slightly jostle in her sleep as he looked down at her and noticed her start to awake. She looked up right away, and upon doing so, she greeted her early rising teammate. "Hey, how'd you sleep?" she asked him, rubbing her eyes as she began to gather further focus. Trevor shrugged back and responded as he didn't really expect good sleep in the first place. "All right, and you?" As she let out a yawn, she answered quite lazily. "Okay, I think." Over the next few moments, the two began to put their sleep behind them as they readied themselves for the day. Trevor, now having spent several days with his new partner, who was well educated on this new world they traversed, wasn't necessarily feeling better about being part of the more informed. He shook off the feeling of being overwhelmed, as it was far too early in the day to begin at such a pace. That's when Kit sat up and spoke. "I think we're pretty close now. Shouldn't be more than a few miles from here." The two continued to gather their things. Later, as the sun began to crest, the afternoon held a bleak grayness to it. It had been several hours since Trevor and Kit had made their departure from the small library they had sheltered in through the previous night. Now, on foot, they hoped they were close, as the vehicle they were in lost its electrical charge the previous day. And while walking through a small neighborhood, things made themselves quite clear to the pair. They could see a community hit harder than most, as their surroundings depicted a battleground scenario from a historical world war. Most homes in ruins, a few stood partially erect as the abandoned town seemed to be completely lifeless. Matching pretty much everywhere else, the skies were mostly cloudy. The sun, shining light over the devastated town, cut through the clouds here and there, causing its dull glow to shift and slide amongst the ground below. As the two watched closely, they held a somewhat muted dialogue. "Arlo believes they release an energy when they are executed." Kit spoke, answering a question Trevor had posed. And it might be true. I mean, the human life is super sophisticated and complex. Anyway, that's why they can't just walk up and stab you. He believes that the ones not affected by the virus share a similar energy with these creatures, the cattle guards. So he treats their executions like a biohazard. Just then, Trevor interrupted her. "Hey, do you see that?" Tracing his finger to where Trevor was pointing, Kit saw a home, about half of it standing and the other half in shambles. As she studied the home, she could see where the roof had partially caved in near the front door. And just next to the home's entrance was a small window that had something of interest inside, now peering back at the two of them. Noticing it had caught the attention of Trevor and Kit, it quickly disappeared as Kit spoke up. "There's another one, and another one over there." She kept turning, pointing out several other hidden faces to Trevor as each one simply ducked for cover once they noticed they'd been spotted. Trevor, somewhat worried and almost appearing to be slowly moving backwards, looked at Kit as she studied their surroundings. Just then, looking off in the distance, she allowed a smile to form across her face as she looked at Trevor and made her summation regarding their current whereabouts. "I think we found a neighborhood, and I think this is where we'll find Logan." Trevor, somewhat appearing to be relieved, but still slightly on edge keeping his guard, looked at Kit and replied with a question. "What makes you say that?" This cued Kit to simply shrug her shoulders as she gave Trevor a rather nonchalant answer to his most recent inquiry. "Just a lucky guess." Trevor, growing to trust Kit day by day, was strangely happy to hear her answer as the two began to walk up to the nearest home. As they did so, boards began to seal up all the windows in preparation for these two guests with unknown intentions. Behind them, as they approached the home off into the distance, where Kit had previously stumbled across something that had made her smile, sat a large sign. This sign was clearly a billboard as it represented the overgrown cattle farm just beyond it. Upon this sign was depicted a cartoon cow, a cow smiling while enjoying a large glass of refreshing milk. As he maintained his focus, he put the neighborhood around them at the forefront of his mind as he continued to accompany his partner to the door of the nearest house. And as the two stood in front of the door, Kit went to go knock, only having her arms swiped away by Trevor as he slightly scolded her. "Hey, how do you know what's behind this door? When you said we had to be tactful, I thought you meant, oh, I don't know. Maybe that we should be fucking tactful." Kit smiled as she pointed to the roof of the house and said only a few quick words. "PVC pipe?" Trevor looked up to see what she was referring to and confirmed that just above the door, a pipe made of PVC stuck out through a small hole drilled through the wall. He looked back to Kit and somewhat sarcastically responded, "Okay, and that means what exactly?" But before he could stop her, she gave the door a loud tap and yelled as Trevor looked at her in utter shock as he grimaced at the scene she was causing. "Lucas sent us. We're looking for Logan." After Trevor's near heart attack, he seemed to be slightly relieved as the short display of her attention-grabbing behavior abruptly came to its end as she turned and simply sat on the porch. Trevor, trying to quiet his shock, stared at her with a blank expression and then looked back to the house. Then, unable to avoid the repetition of it all, he looked at her again, only with a more shocked expression. As he tried to form the words slowly forming in his mind, he came across stuttering as he looked at the house yet again, and of course, right back at her. "But before you said, and then you just, but what about?" He kept on verbally flipping through his list of questions, hoping to stumble across one that would be worth his breath as it had recently been taken away from him. Just then, serving as a partial answer to all his questions, there above his head, a reflective orange flag poked through the PVC piping in the wall. But after just a few seconds, it disappeared as it was sucked right back in. That's when Trevor felt Kit sitting below him tap his leg as she pointed across the street and then pointed down the street. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Amongst all the rubble and disorder, as a symbol of man's persistence, house by house, flags appeared and disappeared, obviously forming an intricate web of communication. That was when Kit finally spoke, attempting to snap Trevor from his daze. "Hey, Trev. Buddy, it's like, gonna be a while. You might wanna sit down." Trevor, understanding her words, thought this was a good idea as he suddenly felt a little motion sick. Still stuck in his daze, he watched with pure amazement as the flags appeared and disappeared continuously down the street. And he finally was able to slowly sit down as he watched this pattern continue until it was far enough to be out of their sight. He finally managed to come to a seat as he sat directly next to Kit, all the while looking at her with a look of pure confusion. Now, after several hours had passed, darkness began to surround both Trevor and Kit. They remained on the porch as upon closer observation, it was clear that Trevor had calmed down. While they waited, letting the sun set around them, Kit had put Trevor's mind at ease by explaining to him exactly where they were. She explained to him that even though they still had no idea where Logan was for sure, the PVC pipes represent his lines of communication. Also, once seeing the flags, Kit knew that this represented a temporary parley with the neighborhood around them, as it left the two with a small layer of security. The sky above was nearly pitch black while Trevor sat next to Kit with his knees near his chest. Now wearing jackets they had in their bags, the evening brought on a cold breeze as the two sat in silence, respecting their temporary secure location. Just then, as Trevor was looking at the ground below him, with his arms resting on his knees, something drew his attention just down the street as a dark vehicle slowly approached. Its headlights were absent as the fully electric vehicle made no sound as it came near. As it pulled in front of the house where Kit and Trevor had been patiently waiting, the back window rolled down as the vehicle came to a complete stop. Meanwhile, Kit briefly warned Trevor of a few of their contact's idiosyncrasies. "He won't let us see his face. He is very private. Back when they were younger, him and Lucas used to be partners, but then they went their separate ways. Just don't expect him to say much of anything. Since then, he runs a massive network here in the Philippines, but don't worry. He's not into human cattle farming or any shit like that." Seconds later, a voice spilled from the dark interior through the now open window. It was a man's voice as he used a deeper regiment, yelling out to the foreign tourists. "You called?"